So what I'd like to do today is to launch the Guide for Addressing Ageism in the Workplace. So today you'll have speakers taking you through the notion of what ageism is like, the experience of ageism, and also we then move into an overview across the valuable resource, which is the Guide for Addressing Ageism in the Workplace. I'd like to acknowledge the country upon which we are dwelling today and talking from. And for me, I'm on the lands of the Mulgana Nanda people in the northwest of Australia. We acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as traditional custodians on the land upon which we live and work. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and we celebrate their continuing connection to country and pay our respects to any people from the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands today. Firstly, what I'll be doing is to give you a quick view on what the elder abuse prevention networks do, and then we'll introduce you to the minister, and then we've got some background from myself, then across to Yumi Lee, who will talk about the notion of what ageism is, and then we'll move into the section which deals with some overview on how the guide can be a valuable resource for us all. So the elder abuse prevention networks are based across Victoria, funded by the state government, and their role is to raise awareness of elder abuse. And we recognise that a primary driver of elder abuse is ageism, and this has been a particular focus for many of the networks in terms of the work that they do. That is the overview. I'll now take us through to the introduction. So we are going to be introduced by Minister Stitt, who is the Minister for Ageing, Mental Health and Multicultural Affairs, which of course is a valuable intersectional lens with the issues that older people face in our community.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd firstly like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we are each gathered on today. For me, that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Southern Melbourne Elder Abuse Prevention Network's launch of the Guide for Addressing Ageism in the Workplace. I'm sorry that I'm not able to join you in person today. Age-based discrimination affects many Victorians. Assumptions or stereotypes about age and capability can impact people's confidence, quality of life, health, employment, and financial prospects. We know from research as part of the Victorian Government's Ageing Well Action Plan, a key attribute to ageing well is the ability for older people to access employment and be seen as capable and able to contribute. Together, we can lead with respect and foster positive attitudes towards ageing in our communities, families and workplaces. This is where the Guide for Addressing Ageism in the Workplace will make a difference. Ageism can be subtle and people can feel unsure of what to do or have difficulty spotting what it looks like. The strength of this guide is in its concise and practical tips for acting against ageism in the workplace. The more we speak up when we hear ageist comments or jokes, the more those around us will recognise it is a problem. With this valuable resource, we can all feel empowered to drive sustainable change and promote a healthier and more equitable and respectful society across all ages. Thank you to the Framing Age Community of Practice for designing this guide. The Community of Practice is hosted by the Southern Melbourne Elder Abuse Prevention Network, one of 8 networks helping to deliver community-based primary prevention and raise awareness of elder abuse to prevent it from happening. The continued support of these networks is a vital part of the Victorian $6 million investment over 4 years, provided in the 23-24 Victorian State Budget to improve outcomes for older Victorians. I'm pleased to see the Guide for Addressing Ageism in the Workplace become a part of our response to combating ageism in workplaces across Victoria. Congratulations on such an important initiative. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Minister. So, background from me, I'm the chair of 2 of the Elder Abuse Prevention Networks and also part of Better Place, who provide a social work response to elder abuse prevention in Victoria in terms of frontline family violence specialist support services. So as the Minister mentioned, the focus is on primary prevention of elder abuse with a focus on ageism. This was recognised by the Southern Melbourne Elder Abuse Prevention Network as a necessity 3 to 4 years ago, I think it was. And at the time, research was commissioned involving a panel of 1,200 consumers, really to get a better understanding of how can we message and persuade people that ageism is an issue and reflect upon their behaviour or their attitudes towards ageist comments and behaviours. From this evolved a masterclass. So we've conducted a series of masterclasses across Victoria, and we've also had some interstate participants. And from these masterclasses evolved a community of practice, whose focus has been on ongoing learning and practice, and they've operated as a collectivisation, really, of responses. And the most reassuring aspect, I think, with the community of practice is that it's a very diverse group of organisations who have been participating, from other elder abuse prevention networks to local councils, to women's health services, and also through to La Trobe University, to the John Richards Centre for Rural Ageing and Research. So I think we can be reassured we've had a wide participation in the evolution of the guide, and I think this is reflected in the quality of what's been produced. Now, what I would like to do is to introduce Yumi Lee, and Yumi Lee has been a peace and women's rights activist for many years and worked in communications, fundraising, advocacy and lobbying, both in Australia and also abroad. She's honoured to support the strong tradition of OWN in raising awareness of issues of concern for older women. She is driven by a strong sense of social justice and the belief that our society will be enriched when we have the full participation of those who are currently marginalised. Welcome, Yumi.
Thank you. Good afternoon. It gives me enormous pleasure to join you for the launch of this really important anti-ageism resource. I'd first like to acknowledge that I am zooming in from Darug country and pay my respects to the traditional custodians and extend my respect to all First Nations colleagues in this meeting. The Age Discrimination Commissioner recently launched a report outlining how very poorly the media reports on older people here in Australia. Robert Fitzgerald said that some of the recurring themes in media coverage are the framing of aging as a problem, and there's a prevailing narrative of decline, frailty, and vulnerability, plus, and we see this often, intergenerational conflict. Another important issue he highlighted is that Australian media representations don't occur in a vacuum because it actually reflects a broader mainstream culture that undervalues older people. So in order to appreciate the scale of the problem, we need to look at the demographics of Australia. There are over 7.5 million people over the age of 55. And of this number, about 4.2 million are over the age of 65. And this number is projected to grow as we move up the population pyramid, with a quarter of the population projected to be over 65 by the time 2050 rolls around. The underlying issue of that media reporting that Robert talked about, and one which this resource attempts to address, is that of ageism. So put simply, ageism refers to how we think in terms of the stereotypes, how we feel that prejudice, and act discrimination towards others, or indeed ourselves, based on age. And we know that this is a major problem when even the World Health Organization has identified it as a problem. In fact, the World Health Organization has noted that 1 in 2 people are ageist against older people. So what is the impact of ageism? Do thoughts and feelings translate into action and consequence? We know that ageism has far-reaching impacts on all aspects of people's health, their physical health, their mental health, and consequently their social well-being. And if you look at intersectionality, we know that ageism compounds all the other discriminations, including sexism, racism, and ableism. Some of you may be asking, is there a cohort which is more ageist than others? Unfortunately, yes. Healy and Williams, who conducted a study in 2018, found that men and younger people tended to be just that little bit more ageist. I'd like to highlight the fact, actually, that ageism does take an enormous economic toll, both on our nation as well as individually. Those of us who have been searching for work when we are older are all familiar with these terms. You're overqualified, you don't quite fit the culture of the team, you're too slow, too old, too outdated, etc. We know this is true for a fact because we run an employment service that supports older women get back to the workforce. And this is some of the things that they've heard, older women have heard said to them. And we know that this is not imaginary and it is systemic because the Human Rights Commission, which conducted the survey, has found that 1 in 10 employers have admitted that they will not hire anyone over the age of 50. And 1 in 6 will not hire over the age of 65. In fact, only a quarter of employers are open to the prospect of employing someone, just open, not willing, over the age of 65. Healy and Williams makes the obvious point that we are missing out on the expertise, knowledge, and skills of a substantial percentage of the population. As noted by Jane Carroll in a recent article, ageism is indeed the most silly form of discrimination because it is discrimination directed at our future selves. So I certainly hope that the launch of the resource will give us an additional tool so that we can support each other to include all the people in the workplace and in communities with respect. Thank you.
Well said, Yumi, particularly the statement about discriminating against yourself in the future. I think that's very much something we should be dwelling upon. So now I'd like to welcome Kathleen Brasher, who will take us through the development of the resource. Kathleen has been involved in the World Health Organisation's Age-Friendly Communities project, providing advice and training across Australia and internationally. Kathleen is a technical advisor to the WHO Global Network for Age-Friendly Cities and Communities. She's the co-author of numerous scientific articles, book chapters, and policy and practice resources relating to ageing. Kathleen is also the facilitator for the Framing Age Community of Practice for the Elder Abuse Prevention Networks in Victoria. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thank you, Graeme. I'm going to leave my camera off because my internet's a bit dodgy, unfortunately. So, but I'm delighted to be here, and I really want to talk about the way the community of practice came together to develop the guide. So, the community of practice was first established in October 2022, really at the impetus of Graeme and Vanessa Hill from Better Place Australia, who really guided the establishment of the community of practice. We had all taken part in the Framing Ageing Masterclass run by Mark Chenery from Common Cause after the development of the Framing Ageing Guide. And we were really keen to continue to develop our skills that we had learnt through the masterclass about how to really message at our own communications formally in our workplaces and with our colleagues, and in our everyday practice, that themselves would support and encourage positive attitudes towards older people and growing old. So the community of practice really came together to create that space where we could test out our ideas, we could exchange knowledge and information. So we meet it usually around quarterly, and the group is quite mixed. And when we first came together, we came up with 3 things that we wanted to achieve. Obviously, the best way of a community of practice to work together is to have something that they're working towards. So we wanted to look at how we could talk about elder abuse, particularly as we were coming up to the World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. So what were some tips and tricks about how to present the issue of elder abuse? We wanted some communication tools for raising awareness of ageism. And then the third thing that the group decided they would like was a way to address ageism in the workplace themselves. So when they're talking to their colleagues or in the tea room or at professional meetings where our colleagues may raise issues that are ageist. So we formed a small working party and set out to look at what else was available to us in the global literature about addressing ageism. Not surprisingly, there's very little done, and we approached a whole lot of people all around the globe about what had been done in this space. And there wasn't a lot, but we could learn from, and we did draw on some terrific work on addressing ageism, on addressing sexism, and addressing race-based discrimination. So we used that as the hallmark of our work, and we then worked as a small working group to come up with a first draft that we took back to the community of practice. And at that meeting, Mark Chenery, we gave the information to him beforehand, and he was able to help us review us and take us back to some of those really strong and grounded principles that are in the Framing Aging Guide. And I also, while there was a terrific working group that came together and they're all acknowledged at the front of the guide, I just also want to mention Richard Joseph, who was really great about bringing our attention to the work on calling in, which is a really important hallmark and fitted beautifully with the philosophy of the Framing Aging Guide itself. So we worked on that guide and brought it back in a final draft, and the wonderful people at Better Place Australia have done a terrific job in the graphic design of the work. So what we hope the guide gives you is some tips and tricks and tools about how to address ageism in your workplace. It gives us a really brief description of what ageism is. And then it talks about the way that we can all become, the term is active bystander in addressing discrimination of all its forms, in this one particularly ageism. And it gives us a set of questions to ask ourselves when we hear ageist comments, or we're thinking about what's the right response here, or what's a better response here. There's no real right and wrong. And then it takes you through 5 different approaches to addressing ageism in your workplace with some scenarios to help you do that. So I'm delighted that the Framing Aging, that the community of practice has been able to produce this guide to you, and I welcome anyone who's taken part in the masterclass to join the community of practice. And again, I particularly want to acknowledge the support of Better Place Australia in developing the guide for us. Thanks, Graeme.
What I was going to say is that within the guide itself, in regards to being an active bystander, I think the principles that you will find are actually quite interesting and compelling. And those principles relate to a number of approaches to consideration as an active bystander. And those relate to delegate, to check in, to diffuse, to calling in and calling out. And I think the notion here is that you've got a number of considerations in responding as an active bystander to ageism, which have a role almost within a spectrum of intervention in terms of what would be appropriate to the context. Kathleen, would you like to comment on that? Sorry, that's a bit of a question without notice. I just noticed that we're ahead of time, so perhaps that might be something that you might to dwell upon. Is that appropriate for you?
Yeah, thanks, Graeme. I think what we saw in the evidence that was available globally about how to be a good active bystander was it's a way of that there are this range of approaches that one can use from the very simple way of just acknowledging that the comment's been made, right through to reporting it through workplace processes for reporting discrimination in the workplace. Often we assume that what we've got to do is somehow hold the person who said that remark to task. And I think what's beneficial about the guide is that it gives us this range. It places it in the workplace. So what are your existing workplace policies? How do you, in the workplace, address bullying, other forms of discrimination? So it remains within that context of the workplace. But I think having this range of ways is helpful, because it might be that the best thing to do is in the quiet afterwards is just to say to the person who is the object of the ageist remarks, how are you doing? Are you okay? I heard that remark and, I felt it, or whatever. But particularly the calling in, I think, is a really interesting approach. And this is gaining more evidence around the world, particularly in race-based discrimination. That idea that you, again, quietly say to the person after the event, I heard that comment and it doesn't quite fit with our values. Can you tell me a bit more about why you made that remark? Why did you make a joke about someone's age? We're all growing older. Can you talk to me a bit more about what you said? And that offers an opportunity for that person to either recognize perhaps for the first time that what they said was ageist, and in fact, as Yumi so beautifully pointed out, the negative impacts that ageism has on all of us, ourselves included, but also a chance to learn and a chance to foster a better relationship with that person, rather than sort of slapping them down in a meeting and saying, that's ageist, you can't say that. So I think seeing this as an opportunity to forge a relationship and to genuinely check in about whether this person really knew that what they were saying was ageist, and trying to separate that out from those people in our workplace who, and occasionally we have them seem to repeatedly make comments that are discriminatory. And for them, it's either calling out or reporting, and you might want a more senior member of your staff to take on that role. So I think having that spectrum of responses and working out what scenario, at what time do I use what response is a really useful technique. So maybe we'll be even in a team meeting, you use the guide to say, okay, when will we use these? How will we operationalize this in our own workplace?
Oh, indeed, Kathleen. And I think this is I don't know if I'd call it the trickiness, but the sensitivity of being in a workplace where there is this unconscious statements happening. And I don't even know if it's casual, because it's just embedded in many people's thinking. So rather than the calling out approach, which is quite often, I think, what we're presented with in media terms in regards to responding to an attitude that could be deemed offensive, it's this consideration of the context, the people with whom you have to have an enduring working relationship, and how could it be that you could do the softer approach of drawing attention to what might be quite unconscious and casual, So really, it's about and I quote from the guide here, in many cases, gently questioning the person's action or language enables them to either express a clearly stereotypical attitude or more likely realise that the ageist sentiment is not in line with their values, and asking why they think they would say that, or to explain what they mean or why they made that joke, can invite people to reconsider what they've said. And I think that's quite important because you'll then be seeing this person again next day. So rather creating a rift, it's actually reaching a common point of understanding, which I think is vital. Kathleen, when do you think, as a general question, a calling out approach may be better prescribed for the situation?
I think if you've got a repeat offender, and if you've got someone around and we all know that power plays an interesting role in the workplaces as well. So often, if you've got a sort of more senior person who can take that role in calling out, I think that's valuable. There are sometimes you've just got to say this is not appropriate. It doesn't fit with our values of our organisation. It doesn't fit with the values we have as people. That, you know, older people have rights. Need to be treated equally respectfully along with every other member of the community. So I think if you do have a repeat offender, then you really do need to say, enough. Or if you've got someone who's being scapegoated repeatedly as well, they need to know that they're respected in the workplace as well. But I think, again, the benefit of calling in is that more educative, more supportive workplace response that I think is also valuable.
It's correct. And I think also within the guide, you'll find some principles more towards the front, which is about delegation or checking in, which is really responding to the feelings of the target or the observation that has been made in an ageist way about a particular person or a situation that a person finds themselves in. And that leads you then to this next situation, which is what Kathleen has been talking to in terms of calling in, calling out. And the principles here is that of one of diffusion, really, about if someone makes an inappropriate comment during a professional conversation, you can diffuse the conversation or redirect the topic. This can allow you to stay on task and, if appropriate, approach the individual later to have a genuine conversation about the comment, which is when you could move into calling in. So, look, it sounds rather prescriptive, but in fact, it's intuitive when you think about it, because it's about relationships, it's about being human, and it's also, to an extent, about you're aware, but perhaps the other person isn't aware. And how can you do the bridging to bring to a position of understanding and hopefully a reduction in the sorts of comments that have been made in the marketplace, in your workplace, I should say. So look, I think so. The guide will be available post the meeting via link, but also within the guide itself, the way it's been set out is it's quite graphic, and it's designed in an A4 format to be simple to convey the message and simple to convey what to do. Because I think if we get too complex in framing our response to ageist comments and ageist commentaries and attitudes, we may in fact get ourselves in a knot. So look, what we've endeavoured to do, and this is what the great job that has been done by the community of practice, is to make this a more simpler response and to actually make it an understandable and hopefully a quick response. What you can also consider, and that is what Kathleen did reflect upon, which is the need to report, and that's the repeat offender, I think, and that's about documentation and reporting, and that's recording and taking notes of the incident. So what we would hope with this guide, it also might be used as a valuable resource for our people and culture or human resources departments to actually inform what they could be considering, because perhaps I suggest this is not on many HR departments' radar, yet in fact it should be, as we all well know. Any comments from Kathleen or Yumi in terms of the guide itself, things that may have been you would want to draw people's attention to, or things we should all be aware of?
If I may, I think this is a very useful guide, and having a great sense of humor helps because we have been so immersed in ageist narratives. And as the commissioner has said, it's so pervasive in our media. So it's really, we even catch ourselves being ageist as well. So I think sense of humor, gentleness, and where we should really go hard is calling out the media. As soon as you see something that's ageist in the media, do not hesitate to email that media outlet. I think the more of us who do it, we can start hopefully turning this ageist ship around. And it's wonderful to have a resource because it gives people an opportunity to talk about the problems that we face. And as mentioned in my presentation, and I'm not sure whether my slides came through or not, because where I was concerned, I could see it, but I don't know whether the others saw
They
it.
did, Yumi. We could see them.
Oh,
Thank you.
fantastic,
Yes.
fantastic. It really does have a material impact on the lives of people. It keeps people, older people in poverty when they can't find work. So, getting rid of ageist discrimination and prejudice and stereotypes does have really material impact. So thank you to the group that has designed this, and I strongly encourage all of us to share it far and wide.
Kathleen, any final comments from you in regards to this?
Yeah, the guide is really the outcome of the framing aging community of practice. And I think the practitioners would say it's a first step. As Yumi said, this stuff is so ingrained in our systems and particularly our workplaces that it's going to take a work to turn it around. But it is about taking those gentle, sometimes lighthearted, but well-placed comments. But we would certainly welcome feedback on the guide. It's not meant to be, the guide. It's a first step. If we'd waited until we had the academic research to back it up, we might be waiting for some time. So we drew on the best evidence we could and the personal experiences of those in the community of practice and the structured thinking that we got from the Framing Aging Guide and working with Mark Chenery from Common Cause. But we would really welcome feedback and comments, and we can look towards developing the work more further as we go.
Indeed, Kathleen. So I think the group was pretty keen actually just to move ahead to publish, to get the guide out, because what we were concerned is if we were to have all the conclusive research, it might be another time into the future, whereas now we thought it's imperative to take some action, but to keep it very approachable. And over time, we would imagine we'll do another review phase where we actually go back based upon feedback and see how, okay, is this working for people? Is it actually a tool that they can be using? But we did need to give it some research structure. And I think Kathleen's experience was valuable in terms of the academic approach and the categorization, I should say, of responses in regards to how to respond to ageist commentaries. I'd also draw consideration to us as we think about, well, what could I be doing? Well, sometimes it's good to draw rather than wait. You could actually draw some discussions around, for instance, at the lunch table in your workplace, where you might be looking at an article in a magazine or a newspaper, and you can say, well, what do we think of that? And that's a good way to actually open up discussion where people may not be aware of their lens on ageism, but when they begin to see it, indeed. And can I say also the classic situation, which would be birthday cards, which in many ways are quite offensive. And the question would be, well, it's a well-intentioned and warm message in that card, but when I look at it through the ageism lens, perhaps that could be better addressed and spoken about in another way. What I'm now opening up is to any questions, I think, and I'm just double checking with Craig and Vanessa in regards to questions that might be put into chat. I've got one question in from Fabiana, which is that, and I'll just read this out. English is not my first language, but I find it unnatural to ask people, how old are you? This is translated as, what is your age in my language? Have we got any advice or guidance from perhaps either Yumi or Kathleen on this question? So really the question is based on Fabiana finds it unnatural to ask, how old are you, and how could this be addressed?
What a fascinating question, Graeme, because I think it is very culturally contextualized. In some cultures, you can ask a person outright, what is your salary? And so asking the person for their age is not a problem, whereas here in the predominant culture, we try not to focus on that, especially when it comes time to designing one's CV. So I suppose the question one would ask, for some cultures, they ask this question because the honorific that they use to address that person depends on whether that person is older or younger than them. So, you can understand why that question is asked. But here in Australia, where we address everyone as you, yeah, I suppose my question to her would be, why do you need to know the age of that person? Yes, because often in our social context, it is not relevant, and definitely in the work context, it definitely should not be an issue.
And Fabian has come back with an interesting proposition here, which is perhaps we could be asking, if we're not asking how old they are rather than how young they are, which is a reframe of the word, which is quite an interesting consideration. Thank you, Fabiana. I have had a question in regards to the guide. The guide will be in here. So what we will ask you to do shortly is to provide some feedback on what we do. But coming back a bit to this age question, this interesting one. We've got Heather's asking, I grew up to believe that this was a rude question, so now I don't know if it still is. Kathleen, what do you think on this one?
I think, again, we're talking about the workplace for this guide. So again, it's thinking about what's the culture of your workplace. And of course, the workplace exists within the dominant culture of the country, but it may well be if you're in a ethno-specific workplace where honorifics and age are closely linked, then it's fine to do that in that workplace. So I think that checking in about why did you make that remark, what does that mean to you to ask that question, is a really useful way of getting an understanding about these things. So I don't think it's helpful to be categorical about some things, because we need to think about the context that sits around it. And having said that, just having that mental check is, does actually age matter for this conversation? Like, why mention age at all? And sometimes, young people are equally discriminated against on the basis of their age. And we need to say, actually, is age really the thing that we should be focusing on? And is it a distraction from some other issue? So I think trying not to be categorical, trying to take into account the context, and also opening up the opportunity for a discussion in the workplace about why this matters is useful.
Terrific, Kathleen. That also reinforces some commentary from Marie in terms of don't ask unless there is a really important need to know. Look, and I think as service providers, our our need to know at times perhaps goes beyond the boundaries, I think, of what is well considered. So not only in conversation, but also could be assessments and such. How relevant is it, and why is this going to inform the service response, for instance? And then we've got some further commentary coming up from Malavika in terms of there are cultural nuances in the term older people, as in culture, it's related to wisdom and experience that helps guide families to be better informed, which is another consideration. I might go to a question we've had from Amanda Kunkler in terms of what are some of the missing areas of research you'd like to see done for ageism in the workplace? I'm not well placed to answer this, Kathleen, but perhaps if you could do
I think
that.
it's all missing. One of the things that was fascinating was I reached out to, because I'm a technical advisor with the Global Network for Age-Friendly Cities and Communities. I'm fortunate to be able to contact a whole range of people about what they're doing. And what was really interesting was those people who are working in ageism in a whole lot of different settings. When I asked about what do we know about responding to ageist comments in the workplace, what role is there around active bystanders? Because I was very familiar with the work, because I'd worked at Vic Health when they were doing the race-based discrimination active bystander work, and we came up with nothing. So I think what I'd be really interested to know is, are these the best ways of addressing ageism in the workplace? How does it link with existing policies and processes? How can we embed ageism into other discussions, or should it always stand alone? How do we make sure we don't forget that all young people in the workplace are discriminated on the basis of their age. So we need to make sure that we're taking that whole of community approach with us. We've had this lovely discussion about culture. So we don't want to, we want to open up what are the benefits of different cultural views of aging that we can draw on as well. So I think there is a good research and policy and practice agenda that could be developed from this work. We've got the data now. We've done the sort of, if you like, the rates of it. Now we need some research about how to address it in practice in a sort of thorough manner.
Terrific.
Can I
Thank you.
please add
Yes.
to this, Graeme? And
Yes,
that
do.
is, we have to take a holistic approach to our data collection, not just in the workplace, but just generally across the board. Because if you were to look at data sets that's collected, often people who are 55 up or 65 up are just clumped into this huge mess, rather than, being seen for that age cohort that they are, because an 85-year-old has different needs to someone who's 55. And I just reflect on a study that was highlighted, if I'm not mistaken, in the Women's Agenda, which is an online news outlet. And they talked about a research study that showed that younger people are more discriminated against in the workplace compared to older people. And how they did this research is that they asked in the workplace, do you feel discriminated against because of your age? And the first thought that came to my mind is that you haven't included the people who are older who can't get into that workplace because of their age, and the people who are older who could not find work because of their age is not included in that study. So I don't think it's the Olympics of who is more discriminated against and therefore suffers more from ageism. I think it is just a blight that should be removed, whether you're younger and older, and especially when you're older, because the opportunities for you to gain economic security is very much less than if you were younger.
Indeed. Thank you. I mean, I just had a note from Anna Gilbard at the EAPU in Queensland that they do actually make a point of capturing 5-year groupings, with their final group being 100 years plus. So, and I think that's the clumping effect, and the fact that through this clumping you're actually denying the voice or the knowledge about age groups who could be participating in the workplace but in fact are excluded. Look, this is pretty much, we're on bang on time. So what I would ask, if you wouldn't mind, is to copy or either scan the code you have in front of you now on the screen, or if you could cut and paste the link, and it's only a 2-minute survey, and we'd be most appreciative if you could do that. And in the chat, you'll also note that Vanessa has provided a link to the guide. Post this session, we will email out a recording of the session, a link to the evaluation survey, and in addition, of course, and most importantly, a link to the guide on the EAPN website. So with that, I'd like to conclude today's launch of the guide to addressing ageism in the workplace. Thank you very much for your attendance. I'd also like to thank the speakers, both Yumi and Kathleen, and also most importantly, I'd like to also acknowledge the great work that Craig has done in terms of supporting the technology that's been required to do this particular symposium. For me, it's been a learning experience. It's a different type of teams, and absolutely through to Vanessa Hill, who was our project officer for the Elder Abuse Prevention Network in southern Melbourne, and who has been critical and instrumental in getting this project up, running and supported. Thank you, Vanessa, and thank you, Craig. So I'll conclude now. Thank you all for your attendance. Hopefully you got some value out of this and will have ongoing application of the guide in your workplaces and in your community. Thanks again, everyone.